Welcome to The Call, an exclusive conversation hosted by the Chamber's Global Intelligence Desk. We're delighted you are able to join us. Please note the views of our guests today are not necessarily those of the Chamber, but we hope you will find those views as valuable as we do. Let's get started. Good morning and welcome to The Call, brought to you by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce here in Washington. I'm your host, Jay Sapsford, and here's today's question of the moment. Are we ready for a new age of great power rivalry? On Monday, the 3-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine, a new dynamic played out at the United Nations. Washington chose to side with Moscow by voting no on a resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The surprising move raised the prospect of shifting alliances. It also signaled that the U.S. is seeking some sort of grand reset with the Kremlin. Today's guest says this will be difficult given the ever closer ties between Russia and China. In his new book, The Eurasian Century, our guest stresses that the most dangerous geopolitical phenomenon of our era are the growing ties between our foes, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. All of which raises a series of questions. Can the U.S. peel Russia away from China? What does the shift say about NATO and European security? How will these dynamics affect the global business environment? Joining us today is Hal Brands, the Henry Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins University and one of the sharpest voices around on geopolitics. Hal, welcome to The Call.
Thanks for having me.
Hal, President Trump's critics have their theories, but strictly as a matter of strategy, what do you see as the goal of the U.S. overtures to Russia?
I think there's a small goal and a bigger goal. The small goal is to achieve a settlement in Ukraine. President Trump has been pretty clear that this is something that he wants to do. I think he's less concerned with the terms of the settlement than the fact that a settlement emerges, in part because I think he is genuinely saddened by the level of human and economic destruction the war has caused, but also because he has to clear the Ukraine war out of the way to get to his bigger objective, which is more of a strategic reset with Russia. There is a long and not particularly distinguished record of American administrations seeking improved ties with Russia over the past 20 years. But President Trump seems to think that if he can end the Ukraine war, he can open the door to a larger set of cooperative activities in the economic sphere, perhaps in the Arctic, and perhaps even pulling Russia away from China, or at least slowing the convergence between those two countries. Candidly, I think that's going to be very hard to achieve. I think a reset with Russia is going to be hard to achieve, but I think that's the theory of the case.
If he pursues that, it seems like this is sort of like the reverse of Nixon going to China in 1972. Won't that lead to rather easy terms on Russia that will in fact embolden them and actually strengthen the ties between Russia and China, because it'll make them think that, hey, our strategy up until now has been working?
I think that's one potential outcome. I think it depends a lot on how the war in Ukraine ends, if it ends, and what the terms of a settlement are. You can imagine one U.S. approach to seeking a settlement in Ukraine that would exert asymmetric pressure on Russia through harsher sanctions and other measures meant to basically force Putin to accept termination of the war along the current line of contact, and it's accompanied by robust security guarantees and so on and so forth. And I think that would have a stabilizing effect, and it would make it less likely that you would see further destabilizing Russian behavior. But you can imagine a separate scenario where the United States provides Ukraine with no security guarantees, or very weak security guarantees, or otherwise imposes concessions upon it. And candidly, I don't think the Trump administration has settled on its approach at this point. With respect to the larger question, I think there is a real danger that Russia will simply pocket whatever gains it gets out of a reset of the relationship with the United States without meaningfully turning away from China. Because I think Vladimir Putin knows that Donald Trump will be president for 4 years, and that any deal he cuts with Trump may not outlast that 4-year period. But he's got a much longer time frame in mind in his partnership with China. So I think that will endure regardless of what happens in Ukraine.
Now, Hal, you're an historian. In the year 1800, the East India Company had 200,000 soldiers at its disposal. This was greater than Britain's standing army at the time. I wonder, if we're going back to an era where we have the world dominated by 3 great powers, Moscow, Beijing, and Washington, are we going to go back to an era where the business community is going to have to take their goods to market with the accompaniment of some sort of an armed coterie or a gunboat of some sort? I'm just wondering if we're heading back at least incremental steps towards an era in which the security situation is really going to impact the way the flow of goods across the oceans and between countries.
It could. I mean, I think we sometimes lose sight of the fact that the world that has existed over the past 80 years, or maybe going back further, or the past couple hundred years, if you're thinking about maritime issues, is not normal, right? So it's not normal in human history to have most countries, big and small, powerful and weak, have more or less safe and free access to the oceans. There was a period where privateers and pirates and national rivalries stood in the way of that sort of access. And so we sometimes take for granted how much the international economy has flourished in this climate of security that the United States has provided. And thanks to the public goods, freedom of navigation, for instance, that the US provided and that Britain to a certain degree provided before that. We're getting a preview of what I think a post-American world would look like right now, with what we are seeing in the South China Sea, where China has basically claimed about 90% of that massive waterway as its own sovereign possession. And we saw it in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden last year, where the Houthis really achieved a remarkable disruption of freedom of the seas through, comparatively low-tech military offensive. And so if we do find ourselves in an age where the U.S. decides, for whatever reason, that it's no longer in the global public goods business, then either a separate arrangement, a separate coalition of nations will have to emerge to secure the seas and provide other public goods, or we risk a reversion to a much more chaotic anarchic era in which it'll be sort of every nation or every firm for itself.
Even if the risk of that happening, it suggests to me that this is going to see a massive increase in defense spending. Is the global industrial base ready for this?
No, just to give you a very blunt answer on that. The Europeans, just to take one example, have the will to increase defense spending pretty significantly at the moment. They do not have the ability to increase that defense spending in a productive way because the European defense industrial base has atrophied dramatically over the last 35 years. And so ramping up production and ramping up levels of productive spending is probably a 5 to 10 year project for most European countries. Candidly, the United States is not ready to absorb a big plus up in defense spending either. And so, defense hawks, and I would place myself in this category, argue that the United States is way undershooting on what it needs to be spending on defense in this dangerous world. But if you gave the Pentagon twice as much money tomorrow, it could not productively spend that money next year because there's not the production capacity to accommodate it. Now, you need more money so that you can, conclude contracts to buy more things, and that gives firms incentives to invest in new production lines and things like that. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, but no, as things currently stand, Western defense industrial bases are not up to the task.
To pivot a little bit to Europe here, where does Europe fit in to the grand strategic sort of landscape if we are sort of incrementally shifting towards a new era of great power rivalries?
Well, traditionally, Europe has been sort of the closest strategic partner or strategic adjunct of the United States. During the Cold War, it was the Western European community that was sort of the heart of the free world, along with the United States, and that's expanded to include, most of the continent since the Cold War ended. And for a whole generation, multiple generations of American policymakers, it was unthinkable that that relationship could be severed. I don't know that it's on the verge of being severed, but it's certainly being tested in some very profound ways right now. And so where Europe ends up is a little bit uncertain. And I think the nightmare scenario for European leaders is that they are going to find themselves sort of the weak fourth player in the modern world. And they will be squeezed by an aggressive Russia on one side, an economically predatory mercantilist China on the other side, and perhaps a more hostile United States on the third side. And that's a world in which I think Europe will find it very difficult to compete because of its economic weaknesses and because of the political malaise that's at work across much of the continent.
Okay, well, that tees up very nicely one of our audience members' questions here. What are the odds, do you think, for the U.S. to pull out of NATO? Or can NATO get rid of the countries not meeting their defense spending targets? That's a two-part question there. But
So the second one is a little bit complicated. There is no mechanism for NATO to kick countries out of the alliance. Major decisions have to be taken by consensus, which means that the country in question could block its own expulsion or suspension from the alliance. And so there's no multilateral mechanism to shrink NATO. Now, there are potential workarounds. The United, NATO, we often think of NATO as a multilateral alliance, and it is, but for most countries in Europe, it's actually a bilateral relationship with the United States. Like that's what they care about, right? If
Right.
you are in Poland, you don't care whether Spain is going to come protect you when you get attacked. You care whether the United States is going to protect you when you get attacked. And so the United States has the option of suspending its treaty commitments to countries that are not, pulling their fair share of the load in a collective defense capacity. The United States has done this before, though not in the NATO context. It did this to New Zealand in the 1980s. So that's one option. Another option is that, the members of NATO could simply withdraw and form a new alliance, sort of formed around the most vibrant military spenders of the bunch. As to whether that will happen, I don't exclude the possibility that President Trump might say, we're no longer in the business of protecting countries that don't spend whatever the percentage of GDP is on defense. I still think it is less than 50% likelihood that President Trump would simply withdraw from NATO, because if he did so, he would surrender the lion's share of the leverage that the United States has over European states at a time when he wants other things from Europe. And so I can't exclude the possibility, because there's certainly no love lost for NATO in this administration. But if Trump, really is the negotiator he styles himself as, he's losing a lot once he finally follows through on that threat to quit.
see, now in your book, you argue that the threat to the rules-based order is not necessarily any individual country, but the growing bonds between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. I wonder if you could just sort of touch on that, and also, as quickly as possible, weave in this notion that the prize here it still remains the Eurasian continent.
So for the past 120 years or so, Eurasia has really been the strategic center of world affairs. It's where most of the world's people live. It's where most of the world's economic resources are. It's where most of the world's military potential are. And so the nightmare of American and Western strategists in the 20th and early 21st centuries has been that a bad guy or a group of bad guys are going to become geopolitically dominant within Eurasia and then use that as a platform to project malign influence around the globe. We've gone through multiple rounds of these struggles over the past 100+ years. The fourth one is the one that's unfolding today, and you have sort of a free world community of democracies around Eurasia's margins, and this cohering group of autocracies closer to the core: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. The relationships between these countries have really flourished in recent years, and during the Ukraine war in particular, because Russia has become more isolated from the West, more dependent on its partners in the autocratic world. And so whether it's in economic terms, military terms, technological terms, swapping of expertise on sanctions evasion, or a variety of other things, these relationships are much denser than they have been before. And they really do magnify and multiply the threats that these countries individually pose.
We've got a couple of related questions coming. I'm going to ask them both at once here. Where do you see the BRICS organization in 10 years? And will Russia and China continue to cultivate and pull India and Brazil away from their non-aligned positions?
So BRICS is useless as an institution and important as a symbol. It's useless as an institution because the interests of its members, particularly its key members, the BRIC countries, diverge so fundamentally on both economic and strategic issues that there is very little chance of BRICS working as a geopolitical bloc, right? India and China, have been engaged in sort of a low-grade confrontation along their border for decades. They're not about to start working together to sort of remake the way the world works. BRICS matters as a symbol because it is symbolic of the fact that many countries in the global South and also beyond it have a certain frustration with the way that the international order led by the United States and the West has developed and would like to pursue alternatives, whether that's de-dollarization or a variety of other things. The progress that's been made, I would say, is modest at best on most of these issues, but it's symbolically important nonetheless. And what was the second part of the question?
The second part of the question is, will Russia or China succeed in pulling the traditionally non-aligned countries like India, Brazil, they kind of go back and forth? Will they have success in pulling them into their sphere of influence?
I think it's not particularly likely. I think India still believes that China is sort of useful economically, but more of a strategic adversary than a strategic partner. The Indians do like and want to protect their relationship with Russia, which is important as a source of cheap oil and as a source of defense items. And more broadly, the Indians just like to live in a multipolar world rather than one that is dominated by the U.S. and its allies. But that same viewpoint, I think, makes it unlikely that India would cast aside non-alignment in either respect, either to partner fully and sort of in an alliances with the United States, or to go the other way and line up with Moscow and Beijing.
Now, in the final chapter of your book, you touch a lot on China, write very eloquently about this. Up until now, Xi and his predecessors have been riding this wave of ever-expanding sort of economic possibility growth, and their manufacturing output has just been taking the world by storm, and that has expanded their options. Now we see signs that China is facing some pretty severe economic difficulties, and one would argue that perhaps the difficulties are even greater than what China is letting on. Certainly, the number of 5% growth from last year is kind of hard to believe. In that world, where suddenly Xi might be looking at a closing window, how might the Chinese leadership react, particularly given these sovereignty issues seem to be legacy issues for the current leadership?
Yeah, it depends a lot on the precise circumstances, but I'll just say that historically speaking, countries that want to change the way the world works, what political scientists would call revisionist powers, they typically become most dangerous not when their trajectory is like this, but when their trajectory is like this, right?
Yes.
When they peak and they worry that decline is about to set in, and they conclude that they have only a limited period of time in which to achieve the gains that they have been trying to achieve. What makes this problem so tricky in China's case is that China, in my view, is peaking economically. It's not going to continue to close the gap with the United States. If anything, that gap may get wider. But it's not peaking militarily, and its military strengths will continue to increase vis-a-vis the United States and its allies, at least for the next half decade, before some of these defense programs that the U.S. and its friends have been undertaking kick in. And so I get concerned that as we get toward the latter couple of years of this decade, China will be more risk prone and more willing to risk confrontation, in particular, to achieve unification with Taiwan or other of these legacy goals that you mentioned, because there may be a sense that the time is running out to do so.
Right. All right, Hal, we're running up short time. I wonder if you might sum up for our members what businesses might keep in mind as these alliances continue to shift. Any final?
I would just say, look, there's no going back to normal. If we think that the post-Cold War era is sort of the baseline for international affairs, where you have relatively frictionless ability to invest and trade across geopolitical lines, that period was a profound historic aberration. It's over, and it's not coming back. And so businesses are going to need to get used to working in a world that is much more divided geopolitically, much more fragmented in an economic and perhaps in a regulatory sense. And they're just going to have to get much better at sort of navigating the differences between one geopolitical bloc and another. And they're going to have to do all this at a time when there's huge uncertainty around questions like, will the free world remain cohesive and united, or will there be a parting of the ways between the US and Europe? So expect a lot of volatility.
All right, our audience has had their morning shot of informational espresso, so we'll leave it there and tackle the day. Hal Brands, Global Affairs Professor at Johns Hopkins University, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jay.
And a warm thank you to you, our members, for joining us today. If you want to connect or suggest a topic, reach out to us via the email on the screen or join the conversation on LinkedIn. If you missed an episode, you can see the replay on our website or catch our podcast edition anytime on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times. We'll see you next week.